Welcome to this episode of our colloquium series. It's my great pleasure to introduce Chris Schunn, who is a senior scientist at LRDC, Learning Research and Development Center at the University of Pittsburgh, and professor of psychology. I did go to the web and find out from the very top of his vita that he works on STEM reasoning and learning, neuroscience of complex learning, web-based peer interaction and instruction, and engagement in learning, which means he can field questions on just about anything you care to ask him. I've known Chris for what must be over a decade now.
Yeah.
Through the association that brought him here this week, the International Society for Design and Development in Education, which takes seriously the notion of instructional design that should really make a difference. Theory-based instructional design that might include things like models and such. Chris actually, so he's here for that meeting. He chaired the executive board at one time. At one point when I was complaining about being busy because I had 4 grants in the hopper and it was close to NSF deadline for more, Chris told me that at that time he had 11 ongoing grants. So it's always a pleasure to introduce someone who A, is very good, and B, makes me look lazy in comparison. And you can read as well as I can, so Chris is going to tell us about models that integrate mechanisms. Welcome.
All right, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm told this is like my last opportunity before it gets blown up and I get to come see a new building at some time in the future. So that's not giving me any pressure.
We just hope it makes it through the evening.
Okay, excellent. All right, so if you clap later, clap lightly. Yeah. So this is a line of work that went through, from a design-based perspective, so many iterations that failed miserably that it was an amazing relief when we finally had strong success in multiple ways of thinking about it. And this is a talk that unpacked what I think was sort of the core elements that led us to finally something that didn't suck. It's the subtitle. So the inspiration that led this line of work was as somebody who started off as a math major, always bugged me in my science education work and hanging out with the cool kids, is there was this common wisdom that in science ed, that if kids were doing mathematics in science, that meant almost by definition they weren't understanding what they were doing. That it was the exact opposite of understanding if they did any math at all. And I'm calling this ironically a proof for this. So the procedural aspects of science, you find lots of mathematics. And it's possible to do those procedures without any understanding at all. And so you can find a student who cranks through this calculation of acceleration by just plugging in the numbers, and they get 4.9, and they have no idea what 4.9 means other than that was the answer to this simple question. And it's usually contrasted against some kind of model. So if they could draw a diagram that represents the situation, that would show that they understood what was going on. So that was sort of canon for a while in mathematics. And you know, it just didn't sit well with me for a while. And there's lots of policy complications. Math and English are sort of the big dogs at the table, and the extent to which you can assist in the heavy lift in mathematics and ELA, then you get more resources, and science should be an opportunity to do collaborative, synergistic sorts of things, and a lot of other dysfunctions. So I wanted to pull at this a little bit. Okay, so you love models, fine. Let's all love models. But let's unpack that a little bit. What does that really even look like in science? So we have something in the world, and there's a model of that. So this phenotypic variation in flowers and in the offspring, and where we draw something, or we have some verbal description or diagram of that relationship. Let's unpack what it means to say there's this model. So the most common thing that people talk about is the abstraction, the reducing of the cognitive load, and maybe some calculational elements. So the physicists love to think about everything as a frictionless perfect sphere because, you know, the calculations get way easier, like that, and also for the learner, just let's throw away all that stuff that's confusing you and just simplify it this way. Another perspective is it forces you to put out your theoretical commitments. This is the simplified piece, and everything in there I believe in firmly, and now I'm showing you this. I'm taking away all the things I didn't believe, and this is the model, and let's see what that model can do for testing purposes. And then the last piece that comes up a little less often is this transformations perspective that you can put in a model that helps to reveal and enable other kinds of operations. So in economics, the supply and demand curves visually help you see the intersection, that sort of point of things. But let's unpack that a little bit more. And that is, what is the nature of the mapping in the model? It isn't just this thing is that thing, because it isn't, right? If a model that literally is the thing that's being represented is a horrible model, because it's everything you didn't understand about the original thing, you then not understand this model. What exactly is that mapping? And there's a lot of complicated cognitive stuff in that mapping process. So there's the correspondence, what actually is, for each thing in the world, what is the thing in the model, and vice versa. It's sometimes not clear what that is. But frequently in science, there's a bunch of math in the mapping relationship itself. So if you love models, you have to, and you want people to understand the mapping, you have to attend to that mathematics in the mapping. So some of it's about quantifying aspects, so what part of the situation is even being counted or measured. There's simplifying, so the model is capturing the mean or the variance of the situation. And then there's all these derived variables that happen in science. We're not going to count all the directly measurable things. We're going to prioritize some relationship, mathematical relationship among variables. And here's, just some common kinds. So let me give you a concrete example. So this one was from a while ago. So how many people have seen this exact diagram before? Anybody? Okay, so take a minute to reason through what is this diagram trying to tell you about the relationship between the climate scientists who are unconvinced by the evidence versus those who are convinced that humans cause climate change. It takes a little while, right? Yeah.
Well, I've seen statistics like this, so I'm not that naive, but that the greater the proportion, the greater number of publications scientists have, the greater the proportion of those scientists being convinced by the evidence that human-caused climate change is occurring.
Yeah, so there's fundamentally this proportion or ratio thing that you have to attend to. You can't just do a raw numbers kind of thing. So to really understand the mapping to the claims, you need to do something with ratios in there. It takes some other common graphs, so like a graph, the rate of capacitor discharge. To understand that thing, you need to understand there's the smoothing operation that's actually being applied to the data, and that slope is a very important construct in that, and that's fundamentally a mathematical transform of the data. There's frequently these derived variables. This thing here is actually not directly measured. If you're getting a device that claims to directly measure it, it's actually measuring two other things and doing the ratio calculation for you on the little dial. Okay, so in the meaning of the diagrams and the models, there's lots of math there. Now the question is, should we have students attend to that math? Just because it's there in the scientists, maybe or maybe not, we should give students to this point. So, the canonical wisdom would be, we need to hide that. That's scary stuff. But maybe when we hide the core meaning-based stuff, we're really fundamentally taking it away. So let's maybe look to some standards. The next generation science standards, which are very much about having students understand deeply big ideas, the core disciplinary ideas, they talk about mathematics being a really important thing, and one is it's bringing engineering and science together, which is a core aspect of the new standards. The other is, and this is sort of fascinating to me, the way they describe it, it's a tool to understanding science. It's not a tool to applying science, right? It's a tool for understanding science. So what are they going on about there? It seems, from the older perspective, not the explanation you would put about its importance. A number of people have played with lots of ways of bringing math and science closer together. There's even meta-analyses of the relative strengths and weaknesses of these things. Do you teach math inside of a science class? So, the way I learned calculus the first time was in a physics class. We got to a certain point and they said, oh shit, you don't know any calculus. We're gonna teach you calculus in 2 weeks and then we'll come back to physics. So, that could be a form, or you have these carefully sequenced at the same time in 2 different classes where they're covering similar concepts. And people have looked at relative advantages. On average, there are benefits, but it turns out the parallel form, on average, is a net negative both for math and science. So this is suggesting there's something going on about bringing them in alignment, but this doesn't tell us at all what that relationship is. It just says they do something to each other. So going beyond this coordinated timing question, which I think is pretty superficial, what else could be going on? So people have talked about integration cycles where you sort of go back and forth between emphasizing the math and the situation and the science and the situation. That there are some overlapping practices. So they point to modeling. Mathematicians model things and scientists model things. They both generate explanations, stuff like that. That would maybe explain growth in practices, but doesn't sort of explain how the core ideas of one would be influenced by the others. I think that has to be more about overlapping content of some kind. So what might that look like? So superficial things, in both you are held accountable for graphing, right? And tables and simple transformation on tables. It's kind of obvious and somewhat boring. There are calculated procedures that are taking place, and you have to work at transforming things. That is unlikely what I think is sort of deep insights of one to the other. The one I want to draw attention to is the modeled process. So let me unpack that a little bit more. In science, some of the equations that we have, they're not just trying to tell you if you start with these things, you end up with these other things in terms of amounts. But rather, they're trying to tell you something about the particular process at play. It's not just about the ratios of hydrogen and oxygen. It's that hydrogen and oxygen are going to recombine, that those things come together in some way to make something. So underlying it, when a scientist is thinking about this, they're thinking about the molecules, the thing that it corresponds to. And similarly, in physics, they're thinking about acceleration as essentially a ratio of a force distributed over a mass. And that explains why there, in some cases, there's high acceleration, in some cases, there's low acceleration. But this last point also illustrates that not all ways of showing equations highlight the conceptual underpinning. This for me is the conceptual way of thinking about this, but that's not the way it's typically taught. F equals ma is a more convenient way of doing some of the math, but it doesn't at all. There's no conceptual way of thinking about F equals ma that tells you what's going on. Okay, so this is all background. I want to take this to a particular place where I started the project. We pitched this to NSF that we would fix chemistry and we would fix physics and we would fix biology by working on making math more meaningful in those contexts. And they said, well, that's an important problem, but in physics there's a whole bunch of people already kind of working on it. And in biology is where there's a complete disaster. No one knows what to do with that, so why don't you do the whole grant just on biology? And then I said, well, okay, since you're paying, I guess so. Does that mean I get less money? And they said, no, same amount of money. So I said, yes, let's do this thing. And then we had a few years of seeing why they thought I needed at least that amount of money for biology. It was tough. So we spent a while looking at high school biology as it's taught to see what are the things that students are really not understanding and which ones have mathematical elements in them. And one of them that we discovered early on was Mendelian inheritance. It's been taught since Mendel. And there's lovely demonstrations of deep work showing that kids really don't get lots of things about that relatively simple situation. And they quickly get lost. So, you're fine with figuring out what happens in a one gene case, you have your little Punnett square and you figure out, you can make all sorts of predictions. You go now to 2 genes, and the better students can do this. Some of the teachers can do this. And you go up to 3 genes, and absolutely everybody is lost. They have no idea what to even think about in those circumstances, including the teachers. You go look at the standards for this content, and it is kind of an amazing surprise. It's applied the concepts of statistics and probability to explain the variation and distribution of expressed traits in the population. So for them, this idea is fundamentally a mathematical idea. And it's not use statistics to crank some numbers. It's use statistics to generate an explanation for this pattern. Okay. So now let me come to something more concrete and some data to convince you this is all not crazy castles in the sky. We developed a unit that brought math and science together over about a 6 to 8 week period of time. It had a lot going on, and I just feel the need to confess some of a lot going on, and then later we'll unpack my evidence for why a particular part I think was especially important. So we thought we're going to torture the kids for 6 weeks. We should make the problem compelling. So the compelling problem was zoos are visited when they have cool, freaky animals, and those are expensive to buy. So I want you to come up with a plan where we give you a pot of seed money and you go buy some common geckos, and you come up with a plan for crossbreeding them to produce some rare geckos. So that's your design task. And the students found that a compelling design task because all the numbers we gave them were actually real numbers. If they solved this, they could actually make a little side business and go actually do this. So we begin by showing them some puzzling phenotype kinds of problems where you've got these two, a mother and a father that look a certain way, and they breed, and all of their offspring are exactly the same, and then you have another mother and a father that have those same characteristics, and then half the time it's this kind of offspring, and half the time it's that sort of offspring. What the heck is going on there? Just to motivate this, what's actually complicated about this breeding task. And then, contrary to how students are typically positioned to learn this, which is kind of the way Mendel did, which is all phenotype based, we now go modern. We say, okay, modern biology, we got gene sequencing. And I'm going to give you some gene data about each of the parents and about the offspring. And I now want you to see what patterns are there. And we basically split this larger conceptual space into two. One is gene expression, and the other is inheritance in gene space. So now we're going to focus on inheritance in gene space to really simplify the task. So they do some work noticing patterns, coming up with noticing mathematical regularities in the gene space. And we asked them to develop their first model. And instead of giving them a model and asking them to verify it, it's fundamentally they come up with a model, and it's got the following constraint. Come up with a mathematical model that, one, explains your data, it fits the data, and two, the mathematical formula you use, you need to justify it conceptually. Why is it this quantity and that quantity? And why is it that particular mathematical operation? So this is sort of the new twist to it. Because once you go and count some things, there's lots of things you can count. Coming up with a sort of a finite amount of data, there's a lot of ambiguity. You could say it's this column and that column multiplied to equal this column, but you could have also done this other column. There's like, you know, these various things to put together. Why does it make any sense that it's this column and that column? And then, you know, if you have a limited amount of data, it might have been add, it might have been, you might have come up with divide. You have to justify the operator. And then they get some more data and they come up with a more complicated model that accounts for more aspects of the situation. But it's all in intuitive units. They understand what all the units are and why those mathematical operations. So they're fundamentally using that kind of an equation instead of the Punnett square as their target representation. And then eventually we get to gene expression, and I'm not going to unpack that right now. So fundamentally, we're asking them, when you have this expression, number of egg types, what is that? Number of sperm types, what is that? And then in the offspring, number of offspring, what is that? And multiply. What does the multiply operator even correspond to in this context? And this is pretty different than the other representations they normally would get in teaching. So sometimes they're taught the probability rules. It's just this probability times that probability times this other probability. And you ask kids with those probability rules, what does that correspond to in the real world? And they have no idea, none at all. Or they're taught the Punnett square, and the Punnett square was actually designed to emphasize an interesting relationship about probability space. You can sort of think of the spatial arrangement in the Punnett square as dividing probability space. But almost no students appreciate that. For them, there is no relationship between the Punnett square and things happening to actual creatures. Okay, so we did lots of iterative design development work, and then it looked like it wasn't horrible, so then we did a contrast study against the traditional instruction, which is based in some combination of probability rules. And in the traditional instruction, they are learning something about statistics and something about probability a little bit in the side of their math class, and then they're getting these rote formulas in the science class, and they just don't come together. So this is a pretty different experience for them. And it needed a lot of professional development for the teachers. There's a separate talk about that. Okay, so you could ask at the layer of the quantitative problem solving, a lot of the tasks kids are given are quantitative problem solving. Are they better able to do that? In physics, there's some suggestions that this kind of more conceptual thinking of the mathematical formulas is helpful. And then, and that seems almost obvious to me. If you make them think harder about math, you can do more of the math. The more interesting question to me was, if you make them think harder about the math, do they actually understand the biology better? So if you give them problems that have no math in it at all, just about the processes, do they understand those better? That, to me, would be a really impressive demonstration. So we tried this out in two different regions, in Pennsylvania and in Michigan, with a wide range of school types, from your particularly elite, some of the wealthiest districts in the US, and in close proximity, because this is the US, within a mile you can have the lowest income districts right there. And we went across these, and these were all first-year biology students, which in some cases is taken in 10th grade, and in some cases is taken in 9th grade. For this, it was just 4 weeks, and traditional instruction covers these topics in about 4.5 weeks. So we tried to avoid the really boring demonstration, which is, I got this really cool unit, and it takes 5 times as long, and isn't it cool that kids learn more? You know, it's not all that helpful in the real world. So I'm going to first show you some quantitative data, and then later I'm going to get to some qualitative data. So for the quantitative data, they had probability problems where they had to crank out some numbers, and we used sort of standard ones they would see, and then ridiculously hard ones that students normally have no ability to do at all. And then we had a number of genetic processes problems that were based on the literature of the kinds of things that students typically don't understand. Okay, so this is gains data from pre to post. And you've got the relatively modest gains in the traditionally taught group, and then twice the gains. Or more, both for the problem solving, the quantitative stuff, and for the conceptual. So that was pretty cool, but we wanted to unpack this a little bit more. So for the quantitative problem solving, we divided it into the simple problems that kids tend to do well, and there's no difference in those. Punnett squares and probability, everybody can solve a 1-by-1 Punnett square. That's not where the difference is. Or even a 2-by-2. It's when you do the 3-gene and the 4-gene combinations where you see these massive differences. So that kind of makes sense. But now let's talk a little bit more about the qualitative. There was a bunch of qualitative biology that we taught. Some of it, involved mathematical equations that were derived by the students, but there was also some other stuff where we didn't derive any models. We just sort of talked about it conceptually. In both cases, they also did a bunch of atypical stuff. So in our units across the board, they were analyzing data, whereas they tend not to do very much of that in a traditional classroom. Both, they were developing and refining models based on evidence. They were asked to argue for evidence. So, you know, we tried to do the rich stuff from A to Z, but this modeling piece happened in only parts of the unit. So now we can contrast conceptual understanding for the parts that were modeled and conceptual understanding for the parts that were not modeled to get a feel for how much of the modeling part matters as opposed to all the other cool things that we did. You know, sort of the challenge of the design-based stuff is you bring your full game to develop a rich environment, and then you have the task afterwards to figure out which part mattered. So if we divide it into the unmodeled versus the modeled piece, we get a transitive benefit for the unmodeled piece, but the massive effect is on the modeled side. So this is suggesting that this modeling piece was really important for showing those conceptual gains. Okay, so that's the quant. It's compelling to get principals and various other people to agree this is a way of doing things, but it still leaves you a little wanting about, well, how actually were the kids thinking about things? You know, you did all this fancy stuff, but when they solved problems, well, how the hell did they even solve the problems? What we did is some think-alouds with students on a couple of problems. So we gave 2 different problems. One involved a relatively complicated problems that traditional students tend not to do well, so a 3-gene problem. And then we gave them another problem that was a relatively simple problem, but a very unfamiliar problem, a kind of problem they wouldn't typically see. These are 2 different ways of stressing out students, right? Just what they tend to do, just a harder version of it, versus a problem they've never seen before, even though it's not really that complicated to calculate. To figure out what would be a reasonable contrast, we had to do some work, because in traditional instruction, in the kinds of contexts where we valued seeing improvements, students would be blown out of the water by both of those kinds of problems. There would be nobody who would solve any of them, and we couldn't see what it would look like for traditionally taught students to solve them. So what we did is we went into a number of classrooms that were, sort of more heterogeneous, kinds of students and backgrounds, where they were using our unit, and we got teachers to generate a range of students that we would bring in. We then looked at some of the students who could solve these problems. We called them the competent ones, and then the ones who struggled with these 2 problems, we called them the struggling. So what would that look like? And then we got a traditionally taught instruction, cream of the cream. These are all college bound at a fancy pants school in AP biology. If anyone's going to be able to rock these problems through traditional instruction, it's going to be these students. And that was the contrast that we have here. What does it mean to solve these problems using these different routes? Okay, so just to give you a sense of what the simple problem was, the unfamiliar one. So given a female with genes, as shown there, what proportion of her eggs will contain genes B and G? So there turns out relatively little calculation to figure out, but the kids just never get asked the question that way. This is one-on-one with the videotape rolling, and we're looking for the kinds of conceptual resources they're drawing upon, what kinds of diagrams or math are they using, and based on their chicken scratches, we then try to categorize them into these categories. So are they doing a Punnett square? They got probability rules. Are they drawing on one of the equations they derived in the unit? Or are they drawing sperm and egg charts, which is sort of the biology that's going on in the situation, or a pedigree diagram? There's a variety of things they could draw upon. This representation shows for the 6 kids that were from the MCM unit who were successful at solving these problems, and the traditionally taught students who were also successful at doing these particular problems. The kinds of representations we used, and so on the left we got them working through the complex problem, and from left to right inside that is time. So they started with this representation and went to the next, and etc. And here is the unfamiliar problem. And not surprising, in the unfamiliar problem there's less to do, so it's a shorter path. And white is a math-oriented representation, and dark gray is a biology-oriented representation. And we split Punnett square sometimes into math and sometimes into biology, depending upon their talk about it. So if they connected to the biology, then we said, okay, we grant you the way Punnett designed this thing to be thinking about biology. And if you didn't bring up the biological constructs and you didn't seem to connect it in any way, then we counted it as a mathematical thing for you. You can see in the traditionally taught, they've got by and large, one way of doing it, they crank it through and then they're done. In our unit, they're drawing in both math resources and biology resources and multiple resources. The dark line where you see it is when they first come up with an answer. So some of the time, they come up with an answer one way and then they check it another way. So like, oh, okay, I got this answer, but now let me try this other approach, more biology-oriented, to see if that makes sense. Whereas that's not, by and large, how the traditionally taught students were doing it. And that similar pattern played itself out in the unfamiliar. You can Wordle, which is way easier than coding. We also coded. This is just a nice way to show it in the talk. The kinds of ideas that they're bringing. And this shows the top is the struggling students, and I'm not showing the unfamiliar case because there were so few made any progress on that at all. And the MCM competent versus the traditionally competent. And so here there's talk about probabilities, and whereas over here there's this idea of possibilities. So they're really thinking about these combinations in different ways. So the ideas that we taught them, they actually used while they were solving problems. It showed up. And just to kind of summarize across the students that we analyzed carefully, across all of their talk, did they make a connection between the math and the science? The struggling students really had trouble with that layer of things, whereas the ones who could solve the problems, all of them made math-science connections. So this suggests that that's a core resource through this way of teaching. If you don't get those connections, you're not going to be able to figure things out. Similarly, are you using multiple forms of inscription? You consistently are doing that when you're taught this other way. Okay. So this way of thinking about modeling, which is not just about the quantities corresponding to objects, but that operators correspond to processes, I think is a different take on mathematics' role. That instead of the operator is like a magical convenience, you apply a transform or an operator and it happens to work, that it actually represents a process unfolding in a situation, changes the relationship students have because it forces them to think about what's actually going on, think deeper about it. It also enables them to solve more complicated problems, in part because they've got more resources to draw on, and they can flexibly go back and forth. If I get stuck on something, I'm not sure, I've got another thing that I can do. But it also, if you look at what happened over the unit, there were just more links that could play themselves out. As they were thinking about, for example, the simple equation, number of egg types is thinking about geckos and the eggs that they're producing. Whereas often they then also had to connect it to the data that they were collecting. And so there was lots of back and forth across representations. So this just naturally comes out, the kind of thing that you want. We sort of already known a long time, more representations is good things. This kind of way of approaching things naturally led them to go across different representations to justify where's the data coming from, where the justification's coming from. That inherently led to lots of representations playing themselves out. Sort of coming back to this idea of modeling education, this is drawing attention to the mathematical complexity in all the models that are there. That when you know, rather than it's a simple taught thing, just like an equation, this thing corresponds to that thing. Understanding those correspondence really involves understanding, in the scientist's perspective, what are all those mathematical things that are built into those correspondence relationships. Okay, so I am going to stop there. I have a million backup slides because my goal here was to have a conversation, and I've already talked for way more. I was expecting Alan to jump in at least 10 times, so I need to leave him and everyone else. And let me just mention this was done by a massive team. There were many miracles that were solved along the way that I've hidden today, but I'm happy to reveal in our conversations. Thank you.
Thank you. Comments, questions?
We're waiting for the camera to turn off before they ask the questions.
I'd like you to say more about what you mean by a model.
Yeah, there are many forms of models. We were trying to position the students to think of models as an embodied explanation of the natural phenomena that they were observing. That it represented the regularities and explained the regularities. So it's both the quantitative pattern and the cause of the quantitative pattern.
Okay. I think model is a term that's almost as abused as theory and other, which is why I partly asked. When I think about building models, so this is a model of that, what I think of is that in the model there are selected things that are chosen to represent aspects of the real world phenomena, and relationships between those things that supposedly mirror the relationships in the real world phenomenon, and that if you understand...
Isomorphism, yeah.
Yeah, isomorphisms. And that you can make the mappings, and those mappings also then form things like prediction, etc.
Yes, that's a very math-ed way of thinking of them.
Quelle surprise.
Quelle surprise.
But I look at some of these, well, it is and it isn't. I mean, I think of the Punnett squares, and I don't think of those as very effective models in terms of having explanatory force.
They do not have a great explanatory force. They have a cute way of thinking about dividing probability space, and that's all they have, in my opinion.
So, where does the notion of explanatory force live in your choice of models and the way you talk about these things?
It involves arguing for why is this more than just a convenient coincidence? Until you add the explanation, it is potentially just a convenient coincidence. That yes, this thing maps onto this thing, and maybe even I make a prediction. I have another case, and it will also line up. It doesn't at all explain. You know, predict and explain are not really the same operators in my mind. So what's missing is that explanation for why it is this pattern. Why does this pattern occur? Why does this isomorphism, why should it have occurred rather than just happen to have occurred? That's the key difference for me. And there are plenty of cases in science actually where we begin with the coincidental thing. A number of mathematical laws sort of begin that way. Oh look, see this cool thing. Hope somebody smarter than me can figure out why. And psychology, embarrassingly, has some that sit in that space. So the power law of learning, or the power law of forgetting, the yin and the yang of each other, it is really hard to come up with an explanation for why it's a power law. From an underlying mechanism perspective, it should have been exponential. It would have been so much nicer if it had been exponential. And you know, some people have tried really hard, and they've got these complicated mixture of processes, explanations, but it never feels very satisfying to it. And that often leaves people in this, you know, it's nice that you fit a curve, but when are you going to do science? And that's, to me, a hallmark of science. That it's not just enough to have, we let you publish, but we're hoping someone else will finish the story to come up with the explanation. And that to me is the hallmark of how a science model is different than a mathematical model. Those are fighting words. It was meant to make you go, ooh. Okay, yeah.
So maybe I missed it, but I was anticipating some secret sauce in biological models where, because you were teaching one group models, were you just using old, you know, off-the-shelf sort of models, or did you come up with whiz-bang, like, you know, a woman has maybe 400 ovulations in her career, and guys put out hundreds of millions of sperm, but they're really just two types each time, or two possible types, and they assort. So was there like some secret model you came up with that was undervalued in the educational literature, or you came up with one that just, you know, blew people's hair back?
So we tried to keep this as simple as possible, as low budget as possible, with the idea that your average classroom has no functioning devices. Even though every student is walking around with one of these in their pockets, they're not allowed to use them in the classroom, and the district is paranoid about anyone looking at any image that is dicey, even though they're going to do that all evening long on their own devices. So even if you could bring a computer in there, it wouldn't be allowed to be hooked up to the internet, and all these sorts of things. So we just kept it super simple. We had like paper models that they worked with, data worksheets of, you know, here's if you cross this thing with this thing, it looks like this. If you cross this thing with this thing, and here's the gene table. They never even got to do any PCR or any sort of fanciness. We just talked about how that worked. And they did 4th grade level making combinations with little cards and counting of things. You know, so there was manipulables, but we did no innovation other than the sort of main innovation I would say in that space is we said, you know what? Everybody can make sense of PCR data. It's not that complicated. And often that's hidden until EP. That would be, I guess, the sort of clever bit to say that that is a useful way of thinking about this problem, and it isn't too scary. And then we made them, you know, draw like tables of numbers and come up with simple old middle school kinds of equations to account for their tables of numbers and make sense of them in terms of this stuff.
So what was it about this that allowed people to do like 3-gene fancy things that they couldn't have done otherwise?
So the simple equation isn't so good for that. It's this equation generalizes. This is a more powerful equation
I see.
for doing that. And it's It's got a lot of things going on. Some level is more complicated than the probability equation of probability times probability times probability. But if you understand it, it's not that complicated.
So at that point, would you pull out the Punnett squares and they were just doing the math? They weren't drawing the tables?
They weren't drawing the tables.
I see.
A couple of teachers felt the need to like show them a Punnett square because it might be on a state test.
I see.
But that would be their explanation for why they showed the Punnett square. Yes?
So then, just to follow with it, do you think that if they would have drawn the Punnett squares themselves and constructed that, they would have arrived at a deeper conceptual understanding beyond just using
If they had derived Punnett squares and been forced to explain why the Punnett square is a sensible thing, I bet you their understanding, their conceptual understanding would have gone up. Their ability to solve complicated problems wouldn't have helped because it's a very clunky tool for doing anything complicated. That's not why they created a Punnett square. No biologist uses a Punnett square to solve real problems because it's just a mess. It was designed for a conceptual basis. It was just a poorly designed tool.
So then just to follow with that, then, does that suggest that when students use models, that they perhaps are not going to be able to get at the conceptual richness of the model versus when they're developing the model?
Deriving models, yes, right.
Okay.
Yes, I agree. And what is sort of atypical here is asking students to derive equations. Usually you ask them to like draw a picture and justify the picture. Yeah.
How long did it take them to get from the first student resolution to the second one?
From this one over to this one here. That is usually a week's worth of hand-holding. You're getting more complicated data to look through and cases to consider and whole class discussions and group work. It's a complicated dance for the teachers to maintain. And we did a whole separate study about how much professional development is actually necessary to pull this off. We killed ourselves to make a fancy online tool that explained all sorts of layers and allowed them to share custom adaptations and did our best to like, imagine you got 0 PD, here's the best we can give you. And then we ran a study to see what were student learning outcomes if we did the 0 PD just with all those rich tools versus 4 hours of PD, which is what a typical cheapskate district would pay for, versus 20 hours of PD, which is what the literature says is the minimum thing to get any real change. And it turned out that for some aspects, the sort of showing gains on the conceptual understanding, the 0 PD was enough. You could get gains just from that. Whereas the complex mathematical problems, elements, you needed the 20. If you were only going to do 4, you might as well not bother. You needed to go all the way up to 20. And the cool thing was, in that iteration, we actually showed gains in understanding probability more generally. We gave math problems pre-post that had nothing to do with biology, and they were just better at probability in that version.
Did you map it out pretty carefully, what sort of steps there are that you can how do you support the students through that? Or?
The key piece for that last is that the teachers need to explicitly say how this in general relates to probability. that in your stats class you might, or in your whatever class where you're talking about probability, you might be talking about it this way or this way. That's what we're working on here, is explicitly make the connection, and then we saw the transfer. So, you know, it's like a 10-minute thing, but it was an important 10-minute thing. Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand the PCR thing. You know, I understand the conceptual part, but it looks like there's a top line and the bottom line. Is that from one parent and another, and the dark ones are twice as much gene expression, and the other one's missing it?
Yeah, sorry. I went very fast since most of us did not grow up under PCR in our biology instruction. So it is the female and the male, that's F of the parents,
Okay.
and they have 11 offspring.
Okay.
And this is for one particular gene. We are creatures that have two, right? And then when the mating process involves splitting our two in half, and we hand over one.
Right.
So it's for that gene, and it is, do you have the dominant or the recessive? So they're looking for, but we actually started off with relatively little explanation. Just find the patterns in this data. And in groups of students, they start noticing all sorts of interesting things, and then we backfill it with conversations about how this might relate to this idea of chromosomes and what this connects to. So we don't start off with a long lecture about how to read all of these things. We start off with, we measured genes and we saw some patterns. What do you see even in here? And it becomes more interesting once you see more different crosses.
Does that indicate that the male has a different kind of allele on one and nothing on the other? Why it's thicker for M1 and blank?
These are the things I'm torturing you the way we tortured the students.
Okay.
And you hypothesize some things, and now we count.
Gotcha.
And then you see what you're noticing that the offspring are not all alike, right? So that's sort of a salient thing. And then across these, you might start to notice some quantitative patterns. And because this is relatively low-end data, it's not going to be perfect in terms of the probabilities working out exactly, right? This is sort of realistic data. We purposely pick 11 so that it doesn't quite divide, and it emphasizes that it's not quite going to be exactly a clean fraction. So there's lots of little sneaky things that you learn the hard way when you do this work. Yeah.
In those situations, the students have previously theoretical conceptions of what you are explaining on that?
They have had some very light exposure to steps of meiosis and mitosis. So they've been shown these things and they don't quite get what's going on, but there's enough that they can start drawing some connections, that there's something under the hood, as it were, and that during this process of mating, you're making the eggs and the sperm, and they have half, so that this notion of I had two and I split half corresponds to these lines. But for sure, it's a fragile understanding. And in the traditionally taught way with the Punnett square, you ask them in this prediction problem, does this have anything to do with meiosis and mitosis? They will say no. Predicting offspring has nothing to do with that. Showing how separate, bound in their heads that part of instruction, this other part of instruction is. Yeah.
So, what, an earlier intriguing comment you made about, for example, one key innovation was helping this, or making sure that the students understood, well, this is actually a solvable problem, we can figure this out, it's not that hard, we're gonna work through it. I'm curious whether in this curriculum, in addition to this work with models, were there other elements that this opened up that you would also attach to sort of quality instruction, that this curriculum might have powered as change in contrast to the traditional instruction?
There for sure was a lot of things going on. There's this larger engineering cover story,
Yeah.
right? That's I've done lots of different units. This one's the lightest of my engineering ones, in part because the lead designer, one of my graduate students, already had another PhD in biology, and she just didn't like thinking like an engineer. It always had to be science for her. So this light cover story across it was as much engineering as she would tolerate. But you know, the standard elements now of what's considered canon in modeling education, of the group work and the developing consensus around the meaning of the models, and the making models visible so they all got these. That's where we spent most of our money, actually. They got these dry erase boards that were yay big, one per group of 4, and a bunch of dry erase markers so that they could, in a visible way to each other, and then showing conveniently to the class to build consensus. You know, so there's lots of that sort of thing going on as well.
Well, I was actually thinking about related issues with regard to pedagogy. In the standard piece of instruction, you hear about dominant and recessive genes, and then you go directly to Punnett squares, which means that your sense of what they really do can be pretty negligible. Whereas in this one, you know, it would take Michael 6 weeks to figure out what a dominant and recessive gene is. But what this does is involve you in thinking about that very phenomenon in such a way that you probably emerge with a much richer understanding of just that.
So, as a small technicality, dominant and recessive is purely an issue of expression. It isn't an issue. You have of A or B. You know, and we happen to later use the labels the big A and the little a to represent the 2 different types. But at this point, there's no such thing as dominant and no such thing as recessive. And once we get into this, we eventually fess up to co-dominant and other kinds of expressive relationships. But you don't even have to think about any of that stuff over here. And that, I think, is very helpful, because the whole dominant and the expression side really messes with your head to understand the inheritance of genes side of things. It's another very cool part of biology, but it's another part. Yeah.
So you pointed out maybe toward the end that it's useful to think of operators as processes.
Yeah.
And that seemed like it was something that has been going on quite a bit in like math cognition, where you can think of counting as like making a stack of stuff, or
yeah.
multiplication as building an area.
Yeah.
So do you think that it's just that biology educators, I was a molecular biology major myself, so I don't remember too much of this, but is it just that they don't spend enough time pointing out that these operators are processes, and you could find easy ways to transfer what we learned in math cognition or physics cognition or whatnot into biology, or is there something more subtle about operators or processes that I'm not capturing?
No, I think there is a parallel discovery, and I have another line in robotics where I was trying to use the embodied thing in robotics to teach mathematical concepts like ratios and proportion in terms of the embodied operations that are unfolding in that. So I think it's helpful for math. The challenge is in science educators tend not to think about mathematics that way, just as I think it's not all mathematics educators think about operators that way, right? That's, I think, a relatively new innovation, not widely held and espoused. So I don't think it's a radically different claim. I just think it's very atypical practice. And including in the modeling education science people. For them, simply the correspondences. I have a diagram, I have a table of numbers, and the table of numbers is fit by the equation. That suffices. And draw no extra attention to the operator. It's that last step.
I want to try to reformulate what I said before.
Okay.
What I saw happening in the dialogue between you and Michael, and presumably what happens in the class, is that the learner is directly engaged in the process of trying to sort out, given parents that look like this, A, is there a pattern, and B, ultimately, why would there be a pattern? And can I see what that pattern should be?
Yeah.
And that's a much more direct engagement with mechanism than the kind of thing that says, here are the relationships, now use this thing to...
That's right. I like, this is the magic, now try it out.
Yeah.
This notion that I'm now positioning you is finding an underlying thing, that's a sensible, it's a possible thing and a sensible thing.
Yeah, and what I was suggesting is that it's that process of sorting that out that may be what establishes the foundation for deeper learning.
Yeah, the constructive nature, I think, is powerful. It is still debated whether constructed versus maybe selected between and explained is equally powerful. I don't know that my data cleanly separates between those two cases, but I think if you really are following this idea of students engaging in the practices, then having them at least sometimes do the construction phase is important. There's certainly plenty of scientists who do a lot of like, so-and-so already proposed this and so-and-so proposed that, and now I'm going to select between them. That's also an authentic practice, but if we never let them engage in the constructive piece, I think we've hidden one of the parts. Yeah?
Do you know if the teachers after this first round, if they return to do it again on their own?
Yes, many of them stayed. There's this one affective challenge. Students who engage with this way of doing things, which I've seen it in a number of units, they think biology is more interesting than if they don't. For sure, I'm now fascinated, I think about it more, that sort of thing. Lovely. However, they also think they are dumber at biology. Yeah, and it's perverse because I have quantitative evidence that they're actually better at biology than in the counterfactual case. And yet the productive struggle felt like a struggle. And some teachers, rightly so, find that distressing. And they had a number of students who were very stressed by this very open-ended process. And even though it all worked out in the end, they kind of would have rather it just been spoon-fed that semester.
But isn't that supposed to change with new standards?
Yes, it will be a while. This, I noticed it more strongly in the private schools and the Catholic schools, where they have students with choice, and stressed students or stressed parents and make different choices. Yeah.
We have some similar data in climate change where when we give people information, often they think they know less about the field because, I mean, to some degree we're cherry picking, we're giving them information that we know a lot of people don't know, whether it's statistical information about global warming or the mechanism of global warming. And, you know, in that moment, realizing, whoa, I don't know what the mechanism is, as they're struggling to do it, and then they see the explanation, and like, whoa, I wouldn't have gotten that right.
Yeah.
That they have to re-norm their sense of the wealth of the knowledge in a realm, because they've just sampled a bit and they come up wanting. So it can be energizing, I think, to some degree, to realize, that's sort of the beauty of ignorance, when you realize, whoa, there's more here I can know. Or it can be demotivating if it's not, you know, handled properly.
Yeah, so it's coming to learn how to handle that. To me, I took this, I responded in a challenge kind of way, even though now I feel less confident about boosting student confidence. I want to study it and do more with it. But others might have thrown their hands up and given up. But the majority of the teachers stuck with it, and we had, I didn't mention it, we showed the same gains within teachers year over year who went from traditional to then. So this is not at all a story of there's a few magical teachers who can pull this stuff off.
It's now the witching hour. I'll take the introducer's prerogative to make one last comment before I thank Chris, which is that what's been raised now at the meta level goes to the whole notion of classroom climate and student expectations for what learning is all about. That's what mindset is all about. If you understand that learning is productive struggle, you take a very different view of your own intelligence than if you think it's one of those, I should either get it or not. So there we are. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for all questions.